It's really an honor to address the Global Strategic Review and a pleasure to join Mark, Bob, and Amos in this panel. My remarks will very much follow up that of Bob Einhorn in pointing at the fact that even though it's quite common in conferences dealing with international security and nuclear risks to suggest that we are at a crossroad or a tipping point, there is, however, a certain truth in this comment when looking at the state of affairs with regard to non-proliferation and nuclear risks. I would argue that in the absence of a serious effort to address the current challenges, the 21st century might prove less stable than the last 60 years from a nuclear standpoint. If we don't pay attention, we might well end in a world in which we could have a non-proliferation regime without compliance and nuclear weapons without deterrence. So let me start with non-proliferation. For decades, the main objective of the non-proliferation diplomacy was to achieve universalization of the regimes. This was a success, as only a handful of countries are now outside the major conventions, NPT, CWC, BTWC. The non-proliferation norm has thus become quasi-universal, as does not face conceptual challenges as it did in the early days. This, however, raises the biggest risks to the regime, non-compliance, and our inability to tackle the most sensitive non-proliferation crisis. Proliferation has been now taking place within the regimes, and serious violation of the norm threaten the fundamental purpose of the regime, which is not only an arms control and non-proliferation regime, but also a security regime with a direct importance for collective security. We are facing significant cases of nuclear proliferation by state parties to the NPT, which have developed clandestine illicit nuclear activities. The cases that were just discussed by Bob are just the last in a series that started with Iraq, was continued by the DPRK indeed. Libya was another case, Syria, of course, with the Al-Kibar nuclear facility, and Iran are 5 cases of country signatories which have been caught in non-compliance of their obligations under the regime. And the outcome of these crises is rather disappointing. One country has gone nuclear, the DPRK. One country has succeeded to achieve significant progress towards a nuclear capability, Iran. Many of these cases are still pending as the programs have not been fully exposed. Iran, Syria, DPRK again. So our ability, and there I will concur with Bob's point, to conditions contain the North Korean nuclear threat are critical for the regime and for all nuclear and non-nuclear parties to this regime. It is clear that a failure to do so in the coming months would lead to a very different nuclear system. And I must say that from that perspective, the fact that the NPT 20 review conference, which is often described as a success because we had a final document, but that was not able to address seriously the nuclear proliferation crisis, it seems to me a sort of bad signal and as an embarrassment to the NPT community in many ways. In the coming weeks and months, and hopefully with a genuine engagement with Iran, is perhaps a last opportunity to solve the Iranian crisis through negotiation. But we have to be clear about one point. The nature of the compromise will also be watched carefully by the rest of the world and will have consequences far beyond Iran. If once again a proliferation case or inability to seriously tackle it leads to a de facto nuclear capability, such as what happened with the DPRK, which we left off the hook when it decided to withdraw from the NPT after having successfully developed its program under as an NPT party. So in this context, the key element of a deal that Bob has highlighted just a minute ago, so I won't go into these, are crucial to the sustainability of the regime in the long term. I would say that the lack so far of international unity in addressing the use of chemical weapon use in Syria is extraordinarily worrying from that perspective. The first use of a weapon of mass destruction in 25 years, and the last time was in 1988 in Halabja. The fifth use confirmed in 90 years since the Protocol of Geneva established the taboo on use of chemical weapons. This is a major transformation of the environment, and this is not the norm of possession as such that is challenged, but the principle of non-use of weapons of mass destruction and specifically of chemical weapons, based on both international humanitarian law and also from a security perspective. And this is a very, very important challenge. And our inability so far to sanction these events seems to me as critical for the broader regimes as for the Syrian case itself. So let me now turn to deterrence. I believe, and this echoes something Carl Bildt yesterday said about strategic thinking, that deterrence thinking is very much an orphan of the strategic thinking in the 21st century, when it is much needed, as we could be entering a world with nuclear weapons but without nuclear deterrence as a policy. Deterrence is indeed facing multiple challenges. Let me look at them, starting with the, let's say, most simple one and moving to the most complicated one. The first one is that the nuclear disarmament and global zero narrative does focus on the delegitimization of nuclear deterrence as part of its sort of key targets. This is something, and sometimes at the expenses of practical steps in the field of disarmament. And this is something that is creating, I believe, sometimes a rather ambiguous results. This policy has been pursued in multiple international fora, at the NPT, at the Oslo Conference on Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear Use, and many follow that a logic which could ultimately prove counterproductive, as deterrence remains the safest policy available as long as nuclear weapons exist. Secondly, Western nuclear powers are not as serious as they should be about deterrence, and have probably stopped devoted intellectual capital and energy to understand the very severe logic and constraint of deterrence and its requirement. There are very few examples of books, conferences, and work devoted to this today, when it's probably very, very much needed. One of the last and rather unique example is the book of the late Thérèse Delpech, published by Rand last year, about nuclear deterrence in the 21st century. So not only the topic has lost part of its centrality, maybe for the better, but we are also somehow losing the lessons of the Cold War. And amongst the lessons of the Cold War is the fact that deterrence is far more complicated than it seems, and far less stable than we usually assume. It does require constant effort, both in terms of credibility. The case of extended deterrence and the debate about extended deterrence in East Asia are a very important example of this debate. And indeed, credibility is not a given. Our leaders need to be making that there are steps to be taken to ensure that the credible deterrent exists. Here again, Syria is a case in point about Western credibility and the situation we ended up with, or a policy of 50 shades of red lines, in a way. And this has an impact on deterrence then, on deterrence itself. Just to briefly quote Herman Kahn on this, sometimes the best way to show resolve is simply to be resolved. So lastly, a last challenge for deterrence does come from the new comers in the field, in the Middle East, in East Asia, or in South Asia. It is quite clear that the policies, whether undertaken by many of these newcomers, are not based on deterrence with all the clear requirements that it has for stability in the long term. Bob mentioned the policies of the DPRK in his remarks, and I think it's quite telling to look at the multiple massive mistakes made by the North Korean regime from a deterrence standpoint. Usually when you want to establish a deterrent, you do not think your neighbors should not fire missiles above your neighbors, and you do not threaten randomly most of your potential adversaries. So altogether, and to wrap up, I do believe that the decisions that will be taken or not taken in the coming weeks and months will shape our nuclear future. I do not rule out that Mark Fitzpatrick good news trend will prevail. There are indeed, as Bob again highlighted, possibilities that there could be positive consequences of the Syrian chemical crisis, as it would put back on track both the P5 process and a collective effort to curb proliferation. The Iran openings are interesting in that context. They're probably not sufficient at this stage because it's very unclear whether we are only seeing a sequence of public diplomacy or a strategic move on the part of Rouhani. Many of us have been following with great interest the multiple statements by President Rouhani on Twitter in particular and in the Washington Post. Sometimes it seems that we have a new John Lennon telling us to give peace a chance. But at this stage, there is what we definitely need is some clarity about a strategic move on the part of Iran with regard to its nuclear ambitions. And I haven't seen that at this stage. Maybe we'll hear more of that in New York next week. Let us be hopeful. So let me, in a final word, say that in the absence of a serious effort, not only to address, but to resolve the current crisis, and there is a clear connection between Iran, DPRK, and Syria, we could well lead into a darker future in which further proliferation and non-compliance cases would emerge, in which the use of WMD could become less of an exception and more of a norm, and this dark future would roll back the effort of the last 50 years to prevent proliferation, control nuclear weapons, and preserve the taboo on the use of WMD. Thank you very much.